just ask, I mean, a lot of this is this extrapolating trends. And of course there could be major, I mean.
We do crash.
Yes. So what are some of the thoughts you have about things that could stop this exponential change?
So the good news is, I mean, it's been long said with Moore's law, doing things in silicon, we can't just do things in silicon to go past the exponential trend. But there's already other things on the horizon, optical computing, biological computing. So I have no doubt that there is a pressure to continue this exponential trend, hardware and software wise. I think the biggest limitation is actually us, because we've not changed that much. And so the question is, do we have patience for what it needs to be done to be a communal society? Does technology end up doing super empowered individuals that don't care necessarily about everyone else? And then does that cause a problem or ramification? I look at the horizon, and it's worth pointing out, so when the printing press was invented, certain institutions grew in terms of power and success, and other ones faded by the wayside. So I think we're in this interesting paradigm in which there may be also other institutions jockeying for power, whether they be corporations, whether they be the public, whether they be government, whether it be non-state entities that are formed together by identity, whether it be things like Anonymous or ISIS. And there's also been some interesting theories that actually say the way we've built our social media is perfect for neo-feudalism, where you've got your million followers, and then your million followers have got their 100,000 followers, and they've got their 100 followers. And I hope personally we don't go there. The medieval ages is not something I personally want to relive, but I think we often forget that the way we've chosen to organize a society is just that. It's just a way we've chosen. We can choose other ways. I do worry that in the world that's moving this quickly, you could look at the example of Singapore, which is a benevolent dictatorship. Every 10 years they get together and they make a 50-year plan. I can't imagine even trying to do that here in the United States. When I was an Eisenhower Fellow in Taiwan and Australia was lamenting at that time they'd had 3 prime ministers in the last 3.5 years. They now just had a 4th one. So it's not just unique to the United States. Other representative democracies are also experiencing this huge change in which it's hard to have any continuity and do long-term strategic planning. I'm a nonpartisan senior executive. That means I don't serve either party. It doesn't mean I serve both. And sometimes I have them both telling me to go in different directions, and I'm trying to figure out how to rationalize that. But that said, I have seen a change in which it's harder for those who are political appointees and politically elected to compromise. We have become more transparent as a society, but that trade-off is, if politics is the art of giving something up to get something in return, in the 1950s and 1960s, you could go home to your constituents and say, look at the victory I got you. And you didn't have to tell the story of this is what I also gave up to get it. But now on the internet, we can all find that out. And someone is going to say, BS, this is what you actually gave up. And so you see, actually, that there's less moderates on both sides of the aisle choosing to run for Congress anymore. Pew Research actually said that last year was when there was the biggest ideological gap between both sides of the aisle. In the past, it's always been, it's been pretty much an overlap with maybe some extremes that may overlap. We're getting more polarized as a society. And I wonder if that's a result of the internet and actually social media as well.
Given the volume of devices that are growing, in this general trajectory you've outlined and the urge to network and share information, do you think that genuine privacy is effectively a thing of the past?
I personally hope not, but I do think it's a very valid question to ask, because I think we need to start taking action now if we still want to hold on to privacy. So when I was in Taiwan and Australia, I had a lot of conversations. They were interesting analogs for what we're facing here in the United States. And both Taiwan and Australia, one thing that was talked about was, they asked the question of, why do we put our privacy settings on the very platforms that also store the data? In other words, we have conflated where the data is with also the privacy settings, but what if we actually separated the two? And you had an open source agent or app on your behalf. Express to it in natural language, would you be willing to share your health data with company X? And you say no. It's like, okay. Would you be willing to share your health data with company X in the event that you're in a car accident? You might say yes or no. And when the Internet of Things comes around, it might say, if I detect that your heart levels drop below 40 beats a minute, would you be willing to share your health data? You probably would say yes at that point in time. But it's separating where the privacy settings are stored and where the data is stored so that you can actually have more control, because I'm sure we've all signed on to different social media and web platforms that have a 30 or 40 page user agreement. You can probably read it if you want, but I don't know how many people of us do. You probably hit accept, And that doesn't prevent them from changing the privacy settings next month. So if we actually separate the two, then you can actually have a broker on your behalf, and I think we probably have the technology now with natural language processing to be able to express it to that agent. Now, that agent would probably, one, need to be open source, so we can make sure there are no backdoors. It also helps if the agent is open source, so you could have hooks so that people could actually build other applications to interface with it, which means you're probably not going to make money off the app itself. It's probably going to be a social good or public good in some respects. But that doesn't mean somebody like nonprofit or academia couldn't produce it, make the code open source, and then that could become something that actually could proliferate in the ecosystem. That's probably going to disrupt some business models. I think there's a lot of people that make a whole lot of ad revenue off our data. But I think that, to me, is something we need to do both for digital privacy now. And I don't want to make people too pessimistic about the future, but again, as Bill mentioned, my background included working with bioterrorism preparedness. When I was in Taiwan and Australia, I also saw 3D fabricators that could print biomaterial. And these are mainly right now printing biomaterial that's food or things such as that, although the goal was eventually to produce 3D fabricators that can actually print organs, so that you wouldn't have to worry about human transplant. You could actually just clone something for somebody. These devices right now range between $750,000 to $1 million to print biomaterial, mainly food. But if we play out Moore's law, 10 to 12 years from now, it probably is not unreasonable to think that for $750, you could get your own do-it-yourself 3D printer that can print biomaterial. And it's worth pointing out that ricin toxin and botulism toxin, which are category B and category A bioterrorism agents, are both derived from food. So if the future we're going into is where cyber right now is an analog for what's going to be seen in bio 10 to 12 years from now, we're going to need to have some way of you expressing your preferences as to what aerosolized compounds you wish to be exposed to. And so in some respects, maybe if we can seize privacy now and actually figure out a way to let you make individual choices and express that, and then you're context aware, what your smartphone is saying, what your car is saying, what you're wearing says it, that will prepare us for the future, in which is going to be more than just cyber. It's also going to be the equivalent of bioprivacy. I actually do wonder, when do we need to start worrying about the DNA of very important people? Because if you can get a hold of that DNA, you might be able to figure out something that could be tailored just to them.
Patent it, perhaps.
Patent it, or worse, without ever firing a shot, release something that only attacks them and makes them sick. And yes?
You touched on information security or cybersecurity briefly. With all this exponential growth and the fact that most organizations are working to get caught up with security after years of neglect, do you think, what is your prediction for how security gets caught up and stays with the exponential growth?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. Oftentimes we don't think about the legacy burden we've accumulated. And I'll at least tell a story from FCC's story. So when I arrived, as I mentioned, I arrived 2 years ago, there were only 1,750 people, but there were 207 different IT systems. So one system for every 9 people. Look in your chair. Congratulations, you're going home with a system tonight. More than 50% of them were more than 10 years old. Even better. And more than 80% of the FCC's budget was spent just maintaining these servers. Not good. So I had 2 choices. I could either A, continue to incrementally update each one of them, and that would probably take me 5 years, just in time to do it all over again, or we could make a major shift. And so what we decided to do is break away from being application-centric. And that's the world I think has been the last 15 or 20 years, in which anytime Congress or the administration had some new initiative, the solution was, let's build a new IT system for it. We don't want to do that anymore. Instead, we want to recognize that the most important part of the FCC is data. And that's really the thing that lasts. I mean, the average app on the App Store lasts less than 5 months before it's replaced with something else. So applications come and go. User interfaces are ephemeral as well. But the data is the most important part. So what we've done is we've done a process of extracting the data from these systems, and we still have more to do, move it to the cloud. And once we move it to cloud computing with a commercial cloud provider, because quite frankly, again, we're small, we're only 750 people. I cannot match the scale of a Google, Amazon, Apple, IBM, whatever company you name, in terms of the services they provide. We can store our data there, and then we can have a very thin user interface and reusable modular code that does a authenticated user, that does an export to PDF, that does show a map. And so in the future, when Congress or the administration asks me to do something, I'm not launching a new system, I'm actually stitching together pieces of a quilt to get the outcome I want. Now that does mean we need to bake in security from the start. So we're talking about attribute-based access control, where it's actually tied to a physical credential in addition to the username and password, which is very key. Some of you may have heard of this thing called OPM, in which that was not done. But we're also talking about, can we also have, at the database level, it's not that you get access to everything. It actually says, what is your role, and does your role and your attributes match what you should see in the database? So some things, the public can see everything. Other things may be specific only to that company that submitted the data in the first place. So we can actually have that right level of encryption in addition to actual access control. That's hard, and it's not glorious. No one really loves taking on legacy systems. They're very messy. Everyone wants to do the new shiny thing. But if we don't break out of this legacy trap, then we're just going to accumulate more and more baggage, and eventually none of our budget will be able to be spent. So the good news is, on Labor Day weekend of this year, we had wanted to replicate our servers to a commercial data provider and then turn off our servers after we replicated them. But we did not get the funding we asked for to do that. So we can't replicate it, so the only way I can get out of the pricey storing the data at the FCC headquarters in DC, which was not the most cost-effective thing, is we literally had to power them off on Thursday 2 weeks ago, right before Labor Day weekend, load them up into 7 trucks at midnight, have the 7 trucks take different paths, because the last thing I wanted was any 2 trucks to be hit by a car, and then show up at the commercial data facility and then reconnect them all back up. And the good news is, we got that done. But it's this moment where you just realize, I just powered off the FCC. What could possibly go wrong?
I noticed.
We did.
I needed some data.
We did, and we showed up at the commercial data facility, and we showed up there, and so the good news is, my biggest concern was, so FCC has about 400 terabytes of data. And again, if we had gotten the funds, we would have replicated the data to the cloud, but we didn't, so we actually had to move our storage area network. If that got in an accident, that's really, I mean, we have backups on tapes, but backup on tapes takes a long time. It could take 2 to 3 weeks to restore from tape, and I don't think the public would be that understanding if we had to do that. So we actually leased a second storage area network that we were going to turn back in, and we replicated our data. And so literally had 2 different trucks. We made sure one truck got to the facility safe and sound before the other truck left. So the good news is all our data got there. But when we started plugging things in, we were like, either A, we've had a massive hardware failure, which would have been bad, or B, not all this cabling is right. And we're talking like tens of thousands of cables that were supposed to match our network topology between the patch cables, everything that was going on the network, cross connects. And so fortunately the team rallied, both contractor staff, government staff, people that had been at the FCC for 16 years, people that just showed up at the FCC 3 months ago. 55 hours later, we got all the cabling redone and right. But it was one of those things where, people were sleeping on the floor with sleeping bags. But the good news is now that at the commercial data facility, moving to the cloud will be done there much better than what it would have been if they'd stored it at the FCC. So these are often the stories that don't get told in terms of the legacy stuff we accumulate. Yes?
Okay, so this was all very interesting, and I really enjoyed your presentation. A couple of things. I mean, one is just this thought, right? I mean, I think you get so hyped up by exponential growth, and it is difficult to understand, right? But part of it is fake growth, right? I mean, so for example, if I have like months worth of music at home, right, as a CD, but if I'm sitting on my laptop computer, rather than sort of putting the CD and I stream it, right, and I stream it like 10 times, and I generate data, and that's really, is it new? Is it? I mean, there's probably a lot of that happening, right? I mean, so Netflix was the biggest data carrier way before it was online, except they used the postal service to carry the data, right? If you move from a regular definition to an 8K movie, right, all of a sudden there's lots of data, but is it? It's so there's a lot of that at work too, I think, and sometimes I think the bigger issue actually is not the exponential growth, but it's actually the fact that things are networked differently, and now we have sort of systems that are way more interdependent, and they're interdependent in non-linear ways, and that's actually much harder for our mind to understand. I mean, exponential growth we'll figure out at some point, right? I mean, it's just, but those interdependencies, I think, maybe the bigger ones that we don't understand, and then we come to the next station, that is, how do we make sense of those things, and in order to make sense of these developments, I think access to good information that is prepared in a meaningful way is more important. But I think the public sector and a lot of other organizations actually going away from making data available in a meaningful way. I mean, as a researcher, for example, I think more and more data is behind commercial paywalls. I mean, there's a lot of information we don't have access to. Even the FCC, as much as you have invested, I think a lot of information is more difficult to get to. And there's enormous barriers for a lot of people who are not used to the way you organize your data now, right? And so maybe the public interest would be to sort of pay more attention to how the data is being made available. Or
Yeah.
even like the statistical census, for example. I mean, I'm not sure whoever uses it, but all the information is available in 1,000 different databases. It's still there, but it's not organized anymore, right? And now most people have an enormously difficult time to find it.
I feel like the internet's become sort of, it's like a junk drawer, you know, the past 10 years. I mean, it's great that we have all these choices in data, but you know what? I'm not saying limit it for me, but I'm just saying at least organize it so it's a good experience, because everybody's time is valuable and we've got all these devices. So I wish there were ways to, you know.
Right. So I would say on the challenge of exponential and whether it's real or not, I would say it's real in the sense that someone has to provide those pipes and provide those hard drives. So even if it's duplicate data, even if, you know, when we talk about the explosion of digital data, that 96 zettabytes is probably not unique data sets. Probably a lot of people have the same thing stored. But someone has to provide it. And someone's going to have the pipes. And that can create a strain on infrastructure itself if you're not investing in it. Personally, I wish that IT systems came with expiration dates. So that after about 7 years, it started getting really smelly and all your users smelled it too. Because the trouble is, I mean, you walk into any situation and you have an IT system that's more than 7 years old, the user is going to say, it's been working fine so far, why do I need to change it? In terms of data, that might be a thermodynamics problem, which is, we know from thermodynamics that anytime you try to spend energy to bring order someplace, you've just created entropy somewhere else. And so if this problem of the internet is there's just so many participants and everything like that, sure, I could spend time trying to organize other things. But if I organize it over here, what other things have I neglected? What other sort of chaos have I created in the wake of trying to settle that? And so that's where I hope in the future we would have things like Cortana, Google Now, Surrey, where it's not requiring a human to do it, because I think I could easily employ all 1,750 people at the FCC to try and organize their data. And it still would not be the scale that we needed. We need to actually begin to have the machine to be able to help make context for you. Finally, on the context of where are we going, I celebrate that people are getting more and more interested in open data. I am concerned that it's still very much a niche that requires certain skills and certain tools. It's not something that everybody does. We did make, as you probably well know, with the open internet proceedings, one of the things I did make the pitch to the chairman and his staff, and they said yes to, was we did make for the first time ever all comments received available on the internet proceedings, all 4 million. And that was the most the FCC had ever seen. Actually, the story that was not told, or not told too much, was prior to open internet, the most comments the FCC had received was about 1.2 million, I'm probably not exact on that number, for a wardrobe malfunction at a football game. You all probably know what that one is. But then with open internet, we had 2 60-day commenting periods with the public where anyone could leave a record. Now that's usually meant to bring out new legal and policy arguments that have not been considered by the commissioners. The 5 commissioners, right now we have 3 Democrats, 2 Republicans, but that's the way the FCC works, is there's always bipartisan presence. And so with open internet, 114 days in, we actually had gotten 1.3 million comments, which was the most the FCC had ever seen. Guess how many we got in this last 6 days alone? 2.7 million. So twice as many we saw in 114 days prior to that. And I was still doing it with an 18-year-old 32-bit operating system for that system that was actually supposed to receive the comments, because we never gotten the funding to update it, because they said it's been working so far, why should you change it? And I'm like, well, because it's 18 years old. And so that gets the question of, you do need to think a little bit about exponential when you're trying to think about infrastructure investments. And I think about this not just in terms of technology, I also think about this in terms of roads, I think about this in terms of bio, that if policymakers don't understand exponential change, even if it may be duplicative exponential change, and how it impacts your infrastructure, then the ability to implement whatever policy decisions are made may be hampered. Now, nonlinear, you're right. I do think we actually have created interesting fragilities in our system that we are only just beginning to understand. I used to work for a different organization in the past that actually wrote concerns that with more and more computers doing automated stock trading, this was back in 2008, it's only a matter of time before computers will begin to misinterpret each other's actions with no humans in the loop, and you'll have a flash crash. Some might say that's what's been happening over the last 5 years. And so we've not thought through the impact of this interconnected, massive explosion of technology and automation in addition to how we live it. And I think the challenge is we as humans, we just don't get exponential. I mean, maybe we get it with enough training, but our brains are taught to think that tomorrow is going to be just like yesterday with slight change, as opposed to disruptive change. And my premise is the world we're going into is going to have more and more disruptive events of either human-made or natural consequence that are going to really stress how we organize as a society.
You mentioned the pipes. I've been wondering, do you have any thoughts about infrastructure keeping up with this exponential rate of data growth?
It's hard. It's very hard. I worry, especially, I mean, well, digital is hard. I really worry more about the human-made ones, like roads, like other things like that. That what's our incentive to update infrastructure? And I'll give a sort of humorous note from when I was in Taiwan. I was meeting with the ministers of communication, justice, and defense in Taiwan. And Taiwan's having a lot of visitors now from mainland China. And apparently the number one critique that the mainland Chinese are giving to the Taiwanese are, your buildings are old. That they're not just built in the last 5 years. And so that's just a bit of a, we're used to that. I mean, that's what we're used to, is that there's always stratification of the different ages of buildings. But there is a different society approach, which is everything's 5 years or newer. Now, of course, that's not going to stand forever. It may 15 or 20 years from now, when all your buildings are now all of a sudden like 20 or 25 years, we need to reinvest. But yeah, I think we have neglected investing in certain things that are important to whatever it is in terms of private sector, public sector, academia, nonprofits, because they are the foundation in which we do the business of being a nation.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking in terms of spectrum limitations and the incentives for cable operators and phone companies to build.
Yeah, on that one, I'm not a
capacity.
congressionally appointed commissioner, so I mean, there's just, now you get into the realm of politics, but I will say that I hold out hope, which is, there's things such as cognitive radio, cognitive computing, which we could very well be, right now when you get spectrum maybe for a 10-year lease or something like that. It could very well be, and that's partly why I was doing what I was doing at the FCC, which was to move it to a cloud-based system. If we had the scale and we had the ability to actually do smaller dices of transactions, you could basically have an auction that would only be spectrum for a month, or even spectrum for a week. And so that would need to be more and more machine to machine, and maybe it's even that FCC goes through third parties that actually create their own auction, so it's not even being done by the government, it's done by third parties. But it would allow basically on-demand surges if necessary, because maybe Netflix is coming out with something new or they need additional pipes or things like that.
I think following up on Johannes's question of just a slightly different tack, which is this proportionality of information that we have, which seems to be, I mean, the old analogy or the comparison I remember is that a Mickey Mouse cartoon has far more bits than the Encyclopedia Britannica, right? So, and the explosion of information is essentially an explosion of video, and I mean, if we just take this to the simplistic idea of news, it seems like we have less and less availability of news, real hard news, and yet more video and more entertainment, more discussion of, I mean, I get depressed about the sort of the decline of information, or the decline of good information, hard information, and it's partly because of the explosion of bits, but the bits are entertainment essentially, and that's what the bias of people is that we would rather be entertained.
Right. Well, I mean, so yeah, again, our evolutionary programming, if you want to use that word, what evolution has selected for us through its environment is a couple things. One, most of us cannot recall more than 80 different faces in our head. And that's because back in our evolutionary background, when we were living our more nomadic life in the Serengeti, we were in family units that very rarely exceeded 80 people. And so that programming is still present in our brain. And so this idea of people around the world is a bit of information overload. Similarly, on video, you're right. I mean, the video is right now the massive explosion. When I was in Australia as an Eisenhower fellow, I was talking about, so their internet's not as fast as ours. I won't make any judgments other than I kind of felt like I was back in 2005. But I asked them, I said, so how much of your internet is currently being consumed by video? And they're like, oh, we're about, right now, it's just early days, it's about 1 or 2%. They said Netflix is coming in about a month or two. I said, do you know how much Netflix is currently in the United States? And they're like, no, what, 10%, 15%? I was like, it's more than a third of the internet traffic. So they're like, oh, that would probably break our internet. So we'll see what happens there. But video is a huge consumer. And it's not just Netflix, it's Amazon Prime, Hulu. I mean, there's YouTube, there's several players in that space. And that is the massive consumer. In terms of being distracted, there is a wonderful book by Bruce Sterling. It's science fiction, but it's fun, hyperbole science fiction. 1998, I think, Bruce Sterling, which is called Distraction, which is basically the premise that the world we're going into is we're all going to be distracted from the things that are really meaningful. And this may just be one sign and symptom of that. And the question is, if everything's being reduced to 5-second soundbite, if everything has to be a glossy video, would the presidents of the 1800s or even the early 1900s been elected, or even electable, if they had to run on the internet and run on television nowadays? Are we not considering certain people for president because maybe they don't appear well in front of the camera, or they can't speak to the 5-second soundbite because they're doing more nuanced argument? And that's where I often say we deserve the government we get, which is if we, the public, don't have that appetite for that, then don't be surprised if it doesn't work out. But I do worry that this is then where dictatorships or oligarchies are probably looking at us saying, why would I ever want what representative democracy or republic has become? Especially because they may look and think they can control the media, which is not a good thing in my opinion. And is the world we're going into one that's going to favor power in the hands of few or even just one versus power of the many? Because we, the many, can't seem to be focused enough to actually do any long-term strategy. And that makes me kind of pessimistic about the future of representative democracy, but that's why I keep on fighting. And I keep on doing it. Yes, go ahead.
So, if I may, I mean,
Since we have such a shooty conversation.
Because I mean, you started by talking about the public interest and things like this. And I think these are extremely important things, right? And so let me see if I can even phrase the question right. It's not yet clear in my mind. But I was last Tuesday. I was at the Department of State at a conference that the Office of the Chief Economist organized. And one of the questions that was explored there was how can we assess and understand the impact that public policy has on our interconnected system. Right? And speaker after speaker after speaker, the claim was we have a ton of information, but the things that we need to know to answer the questions that we would like to have answers we don't have. Okay? And I think there's a big issue here because there seems to be sort of this perception. I'm wondering what you see in Washington about this. That sort of somehow the data generates itself, right? But raw data is an oxymoron, right? Everything is curated in a sense. And I think if you go back to the 1930s, 1940s, when the time when the current statistics started, people had very specific questions in mind they wanted to answer. And then the design, sort of a system of collecting information, organizing information, to be able to help understand those questions. And it seems that right now we don't really have those questions, right? And so we have a sense that somehow we collect everything, but in between collecting everything, those things that we would really need, those variables, those parameters to answer good questions, they're not collected. And all of a sudden, or they're sort of somewhere behind the paywall.
Yeah, we expect magic to happen.
Whether you see anything in that direction where we sort of rethink what would we need to know in an exponentially growing, increasingly interconnected planet to answer the questions that probably sort of are really close to what we need to know. That is, how do we not trash the planet? How do we not crash the economy? How do we sort of fight unemployment? How do we,
Completely. In fact, there's one of my favorite phrases, I think, is E. Cummings saying, always a more beautiful answer that asks a more beautiful question, which is you really need to spend a lot of time thinking about the questions you want to ask that aren't even answerable. Because you're right, I think there's this myth that big data is apparently magic happens, like sprinkle fairy dust and just let I know everything. And oftentimes, I'll give you one concrete example. I can demonstrate, based on data, it's not just me, but I've seen this been done, I can demonstrate with 99.6% confidence that the correlation between the divorce rate in Vermont and the price of butter in Oregon is 99.6%. So I'm less than, and so that's a high degree of correlation. Do you think that the divorce rate in Vermont is actually causing the price of butter to go up or down in Oregon? No, but it's just the pattern has been found in the data. And so that's where, again, you have to think about what's the question you're asking, what's the theory you're trying to apply to the world. Correlation is not causality, all those different things.
So
And-
Vermont has better butter, or what? What I miss? I'm sorry.
That's right.
Butter, high prices in butter
Okay.
apparently cause divorces in Vermont, is what we can conclude. Probably not the case. But anyway, it's spurious connections. But this is what happens when you get enough data. You will find connections that are probably meaningless. It's just you found a connection. So, in terms of how do we go forward as a society, I think the challenge is have we lost the ability to think long term because of the slope of that exponential curve? Back in the 50s and the 60s, you would imagine that those individuals who were presidentially elected could set the 10-year plan. We're going to go to the moon in 10 years. Or we're going to have this initiative to be more diplomatic and open with China, or whatever it might be. We could do that and have a 10-year plan. I have very rarely in the last few years seen long-term plans being released. And again, I'm a nonpartisan senior executive, so my job is to take whatever those long-term plans are and move them forward. Oftentimes, however, I'm interacting with political appointees, and this is no disrespect to them, it's just their time horizon is 3 months. They want to get something done in 3 months, and so I will help them achieve that as best I can. But then the burden falls on me as a nonpartisan individual to also think, well, what can I do to actually sustain the overall public service effort that's more than just a 3 months effort to go through from there. Combined with the fact that right now, there is a perception that a lot of people who are in government are simply just bureaucrats that are change resistant, when in fact we're extremely hungry and chomping at the bit for change. We just sometimes don't have the political top cover. I personally look at it, the worst I can do is I will be fired, so I'll let you guys know if I'm fired in 6 months. But I will at least try and make change while I'm here, because I don't think the status quo will get us anywhere. In fact, we'll fall further behind with the world we're going into.
Can I, I'm sorry. Somebody
Well, I was
else.
just gonna say, it sounds like the problem is a lot more about lack of shared goals. And when you're making a 10-year plan, it's because you have a goal that you want to achieve, but if we can't agree on the goals, it's also pretty hard to plan.
Very hard, and I agree with you. In fact, back when I was doing my dissertation, I was looking at when do more people make better decisions, when do more people make worse decisions. Because I had been involved in the response to 9/11, I've been in response to anthrax. And one of the things in which more people make better decisions is when there are shared goals plus a diversity of views. But as we know, sometimes getting a diversity of views makes it very hard to have shared goals. So I see my job when I'm in any organization is to listen to all the different narratives and try to stitch them together in such a way in which maybe there's still differences on the extremes, but there's at least a common narrative, even if they are different goals across the aisle.
Could I, just off the wall, but it's stimulated by your talk, is maybe we don't need to have long-term planning anymore. Because in a way, with collective distributed intelligence, we don't have long-term plans on a lot of things. Like, I don't plan out how I'm gonna get from one place to another. I turn on my GPS and I make decisions as I go, on health, we want a healthier society, but we don't make a 10-year plan on necessarily. We see what's going on in the world and we respond to signals on a short-term basis.
I definitely think you should pivot. I'm not saying we shouldn't be adaptable and pivot, because I would say, as they say from the state of the military, any battle plan lasts the first 5 seconds of battle. But I think we should at least identify which battles we want to fight. And so what I'm seeing is the lack of what things are we aiming for that we want to achieve, not necessarily how we get there. So it's not a 10-year plan, but it's just what things are important in terms of priority. It can't have everything be high priority. If everything's number one, then nothing's high priority. But what things do we want to focus on to try and achieve right now? What things we want to be more in a 5-year plan, 10-year plan? Because I can tell you that other countries are coming up with their 10-year objectives. Because whether they're a dictatorship or an oligarchy, they can reach that consensus and say, our goal is in 10 years we will achieve the following things. And they don't know exactly how they're going to get there, and they'll probably pivot and make adjustments along the way, and I think that's well and good. We just haven't put that stake in the ground and said to ourselves, come 2025, what do we want the U.S. to be leading?
But do you think that a lot of actors are making long-term plans, or at least medium-term plans, corporations, health agencies, things like that, and acquiring a lot of this data? It's not necessarily open data, but a lot of those exabytes.
So that's a good question. I think some are. I think there's also, though, I've seen some stuff with Harvard Business Review that actually lament that publicly traded companies, the publicly traded stock price makes them only focus on the next quarter. So
Yeah,
they
I
also
think
have a
maybe
problem
half a year's
too. This
long-term
is
plan.
not just a public sector issue. This is a private sector issue too.
I guess I was thinking more of asking the right questions, but
Right.
I guess the question is, how can we maximize profit in the next 3 months? So-
Right. And this is a classic problem too. I mean, Jim March in his exploration exploitation paper in 1993 talks about in a rapidly changing environment, if you keep on doing what you've been doing, that will actually have better outcomes than trying to explore in the short term. But as the environment continues to change, if all you do is keep on doing what you've been doing, you will quickly lose relevance, and exploration will eventually pay off. But it's how do you make that trade-off between doing what you've been doing that's been successful so far, and that's personally why I try to go to situations, I hate to say this, I go to places where things are so bad, the crisis is now pronounced, because then I can challenge the status quo and say, clearly what we've been doing, when I talk about there had been, I didn't mention at the FCC there had been 9 COs in 8 years prior to my arrival. So the good news is I'm now twice past the average, but that was enough to tell me clearly what they had been doing was not succeeding, and so I could challenge it. And so I think this is a fundamental organizational issue, whether it's in the private sector or public sector, which is when do you make the choice to do what you're doing because that's being successful and profitable, and when do you choose to invest funds that may not pan off right away, it may not even pan off during your tenure, but if you don't invest in them, you're going to lose relevancy 2 years or 3 years from now.
The innovator's dilemma.
Yeah, very much. And yes, go ahead.
I was thinking about getting back to the public sector. You were saying, like at the sort of, I don't want to use the word bureaucrat, but the public servants, not the politicians. There's at a high level there's actually a sense of motivation, even a sense perhaps of agreement on the goals. And what I'm getting at here, you're talking about what are the goals, the priorities, and the sense I'm getting is maybe among that sector in the government, there's actually a fairly shared sense of goals and priorities. And I would also argue that among the population, there's, at least on some goals, there's a pretty healthy majority that agree in general about certain goals. I would suggest climate change might be one. I don't know if that is, but I'll
It can
throw
be a
that
third
out.
real issue sometimes. As one who's worked for both Democrats and Republicans, and oftentimes, sometimes for them both simultaneously, I usually try to just focus on, quite frankly, I have a phrase which is GSD, which is get stuff done. In fact, my team knows it. It's my hashtag. Get stuff done is maybe the polite version. But the second thing is, how can we get things done in a leaner, faster time to market approach? And then I let the policy decisions be made by those that are politically elected. Now, I will try and provide them scientific data, whether they choose to accept it or not. I will try and provide them papers and resources that say, here's what the science says. But I also have to be at a certain point in time willing to walk away when they say, you know what, we want to go this certain way, or we have a certain interpretation. That's just the mantle of being a career senior executive. When I was in Afghanistan, one of the things I did very quickly was I said, why are we burning the poppies? Not even technology related at all. And they said, well, we think it's funding the Taliban. I was like, I'm pretty sure the Taliban's no longer, this was 2009, I'm pretty sure the Taliban's no longer in Afghanistan, so let's look at the data. And when you look at the data, what you find out is that in Afghanistan, Taliban's probably not in Afghanistan, they go into Pakistan, but then 2, there's warlords, and they're not necessarily an intersecting Venn diagram between the Taliban and the warlords. That said, back in the 1990s, there had been an oversupply of poppies in Afghanistan. And so they actually came out and said, you know, it's against the Quran to grow poppies because they're mind-altering substances. But they said this after they had bought up all the poppies. And poppies remain stable. As morphine base, it can last 10 to 15 years. So they bought them all up before they said that, and then they sold them at a premium because now there was a artificial scarcity. They started to run out of supplies, and so they came back and they said, you know what, it's okay because you're not actually hurting us. You're hurting others, but you're Westerners or the foreigners, and so it's okay to grow. And they were about to have another oversupply in the market until we showed up and started burning them, which created an artificial scarcity and actually helped drive up their profit margin. So I was able to say to the United States forces and say, in NATO, I said, stop burning the poppies. Instead, focus on precursor chemicals used to treat poppies into heroin and opiums, and 2, the trafficking of the drugs outside of the country. And they got that. But I had to go to another country's government that was not the U.S., I will not name them, but they said, you know, it looks good for our soldiers to be doing something in the papers, and so we're going to continue our strategy of burning the poppies. And at a certain point, I decided to say, okay, that's your call. But that's the same way I think a lot of career civil servants, and I won't say all of them, but I know a lot of them that I meet with that are just chomping at the bit to try and make things more effective, leaner, allow risk-taking. And that's something that right now is not allowed currently in the government we have. Is risk taking is very much frowned upon. There is no top cover if you make a mistake, and people are out the door. And I would rather have people that take risks than people that never do any risk at all. Now it has to be calculated because we can't. Unlike a venture capital fund, if they try to do some startup and it doesn't work out, they can't go around and say we need another round of money. Permanent events can't say, yeah, we tried that out, sorry, it didn't work, can we get another $50 billion, please? So you have to be good stewards of the taxpayers' dollars, but if we don't take risks and we don't try to do experiments, we will always be doing what we've always done. And we're just going to go by the wayside. Yeah, I mean, I think
Too much information.
Well, and I think it's one of those things that we've had this artificial dialogue that somehow government is an us versus them. That it's the bureaucrats in Washington. My wife often says, you know, if I'm a fat cat, I'm one of the leanest fat cats she's ever met because, you know, there's a lot of people working very long days with no hope of an IPO in sight or no bonuses. I mean, that's just what we do because we care. But that's missed because I don't think we separate, one, the differences between political appointees and those that are nonpartisan that are just trying to get it done. And then two, we miss the fact that we, the public, maybe aren't tolerant of those that are trying to take risks, that are trying to go out there. And so we shouldn't be surprised if the people we are rewarding are those that don't stick their neck out, that they'll just keep on the status quo. And if we feed into that narrative, we're going to get what we deserve.
I was speaking to senior civil servants about, and I accused them of not being risk adverse, and they jumped all over me. And basically saying that, you know, that actually, well, first of all, governments don't die, all right? And businesses can go overnight and so forth. And then, in a way, we think government, I mean,
there are certain things you don't want to go bankrupt or out of business. Kind of like our military forces, you know.
Yeah.
Creative disruption can happen in the marketplace, and I think that's how you're seeing. I mean, the interesting story is, 1950s, the average company was on the S&P 500 for 61 years. That was the average lifespan. Guess what it is now? It's 11 years. So the exponential change is shrinking the time of life of successful companies. The trouble is, we can't have that be done, and I mean, maybe we're already having it. Maybe that's Greece. I don't know. We can't have certain governments. You know, there's only one. And so the question is, how can we actually encourage rejuvenation from the inside, recognizing that this is a 240-year-old, and that's small by other countries' time frame. This is a 240-year-old organization.
But in some ways, politically, it fails regularly. I mean, it's basically we're throwing out the bums every cycle, and you just get new bums, and they don't, you know,
Right.
they stop people like you doing things.
Well, and that's part of the checks and balances. I mean, I'm here to serve whoever it is. Yeah, that's where I really think it's got to be at least a three-way. I mean, the thing I hold out hope for is both the public. I don't think all of the public, because most people won't want to spend this time diving this deeper into issues. This is clearly more than a 5-second soundbite we've had here today. But some of the public, and I think some industry, will recognize that if they don't have a stable marketplace to sell to, then they've got issues. And again, I think cyber, in my opinion, cyber is an analog for more to come on the horizon, which is the empowerment of individuals to do things that in the past only nation states could do. So that's true of cyber. I think bio is the next thing on the horizon. When we start actually having do-it-yourself DNA sequencing, you know, what is it when someone's able to actually capture my DNA and know what things I have in terms of my genetic weaknesses? Could they use that to blackmail me? Could they use that to exploit me? Do I need to have the ability to actually prevent you from sequencing my DNA, and what technology is that? Bio is going to be here faster than we know. And so the question is, does that fundamentally make it difficult for the nation state to continue to provide its social contract to the population? I also worry about the rate of change that's going on in the world in terms of skills that you train for today may no longer be relevant 8 or 9 years from now. And so do we need to have a social contract with the public that says, you need to be educated and trained for life. If your job is lost because of the rate of change, because of whatever directions we take in terms of global trade or things like that, part of the social contract is not just unemployment benefits, but also those employment benefits are tied to you demonstrating you are trying to get retrained for some other skill. And you can pick what it is, it's your choice, but we need to do that. I also think about, for cybersecurity, I may be crazy, but everything I saw in Australia and Taiwan convinced me that we at least need to have an open approach to cybersecurity. What do I mean by that? Right now, most companies and most public and private sector organizations are doing their own sort of castle and moat approach. They set up their own firewall, maybe have intrusion detection, maybe have behavioral detection if they're lucky, but they're only aware of what things they're seeing at their castle. And so they're only as smart as their castle. Well, what if instead every castle had a way of sharing what other castles were seeing in near real time? So that way, if you start seeing an exploit at this place over here, you don't have to wait until it hits you. You could actually become more self-aware. And we have some of those things already coming out with some products, but they're only individual to that product. And what I would prefer is a place that was open, that one, provided safe harbor to anyone that actually contributed data, because safe harbor is important. Two, much like public health at the federal level, it anonymized and we don't know who you are. It's just the signs and symptoms of that presentation. At the federal level, if you come down with some infectious disease, we just know your demographics, signs and symptoms, and that's enough to be useful. So we can do the same thing in terms of cyber public health as well. And then this is available to anybody. And someone might say, well, what if the bad guys get a hold of that data too? I was like, okay, so they actually see that we're aware of their tactics and techniques. They're going to change to something else. I actually want them to be aware. But it would allow us to, one, show that we could do an open approach to cybersecurity, and two, an open approach that is not tied to any one government, but is actually public in nature.
So as kind of part of what you're talking about sounds like you were talking about before, like the agents that actually serve us. It's like an open source software layer that includes modules that basically provide some of the services that private companies and governments might provide, but it's controlled by us, as opposed to, I mean, one of the problems I have with Facebook and so on, it's I don't have much control over the convenience and the ease of communication that's provided to me, whereas my understanding of things like, I know Doc Searles is working on something like that those things are really to empower the citizens in a very practical way.
Right.
And because it's open source, as you said, it's in some ways it's more secure. Is that consistent with what
It is.
you're
I'm a
describing?
big believer of, one, make it open. Two, I'm a big believer of what's called choice architectures. So the idea is we each are probably going to have different views about what we want to do, and that's actually great. And so if I give you an architecture in which you can express your choices, whether you want to be tighter on your security and less using of open source apps, or you want to use more open source apps and less on your security, whatever it might be, you can make that choice, and it's okay within the entire architecture. And I think that's necessary because, again, the world we're going into is individuals will now have abilities that were only available to large corporations or nation states in the past. And I think that, in my mind, is the only way we're actually going to tackle this world we're going into, in which there's huge amounts of freedom to do good, and there's huge amounts of freedom to do less than good too. And that's where, again, I also raise the idea of the community watch, like through open source. Can we choose to opt in and do things like this? In some respects, the interesting thing about the internet is, instead of it actually making us all one amorphous, singular, homogeneous blog, it's actually allowing us to be very diverse, singular, and individual in nature. And I think that's actually something I celebrate. It's almost like we can each express our own preferences and be what we want to be.